I've never been a huge fan of Christmas. Don't get me wrong, I love the decorations, the food, and the general vibe, but the whole holiday cheer thing, it's never been my thing. That's why I usually spend Christmas Eve at home with a good book or a movie, away from the holiday madness. This story, though, is what made me swear off Christmas Eve alone in my house forever. It all started a few years ago. I was living in a small suburban neighborhood, the kind where everyone knows each other and the houses all look the same. It was snowing heavily that evening, and I remember feeling cozy inside, enjoying the soft glow of my Christmas lights flickering on the window. I had just finished a nice dinner and was about to settle in with a book when I heard something. At first I thought it was just the wind, or maybe a car driving by, but then I heard it again singing. At first I was a little confused. It was way past the time when most carolers would come around, but the singing was close, right outside my front door. It sounded like a small group, maybe 3 or 4 voices, harmonizing to some classic Christmas carol. I wasn't expecting anyone, and I wasn't exactly in the mood for visitors, but I figured it wouldn't hurt to just open the door for a second. After all, carolers are supposed to be cheerful and fun, right? I opened the door just a crack, peeking out to see who was there, but what I saw made my blood run cold. Standing on my doorstep was a group of 3 people, all dressed in heavy winter coats, scarves, and mittens, like they had just come from a long walk in the snow. Their faces were obscured by shadows, but their voices were almost angelic. They were singing something I didn't recognize, a strange, haunting melody, almost like a lullaby, but with an eerie, unsettling tone. There was no one else around, no sign of cars or other people. It was just them standing there in the snow, looking like they had been there for a while. The thing that bothered me immediately wasn't their singing, though it was odd enough. It was their appearance, their eyes. They weren't looking at me. They were staring off into the distance, almost as if they didn't even know I was there. Their faces were pale, like they hadn't seen sunlight in years, and their features were oddly symmetrical, too perfect to be real. It made my stomach twist. But the strangest part? They didn't seem to notice I was there. I called out to them, asking if they needed anything or if they were lost, but they didn't respond. They just kept singing that same creepy song. I started to feel uncomfortable, so I decided to shut the door and lock it. As I closed it, I caught a glimpse of their hands, which were positioned at their sides, stiff and unnatural. Their fingers were long and bony, the skin almost translucent, like they had been stretched too thin. I locked the door quickly, feeling my heart race. I didn't know what was going on, but I didn't want any part of it. The moment I shut the door, the singing stopped, and then, silence. Complete, unnatural silence. I waited for a few seconds, listening. Nothing. No footsteps, no murmurs, just the cold chill of the winter night. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe they were just a group of weird people, maybe even pranksters out in the snow, trying to have some fun. But the more I thought about it, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but I couldn't help it. Something about the way they stood there, motionless, staring into nothingness, it wasn't normal. After a few minutes, I decided I needed to check outside. Maybe I could get a glimpse of them walking away, or at least get some confirmation that they were real people. I grabbed a flashlight, unlocked the door, and stepped outside. The snow had covered everything, but there was no sign of the carolers. Not a single footprint in the snow. It was like they had just disappeared into thin air. I walked around the side of the house, shining the flashlight on the snow, but it was like they had never been there. I checked the street and the neighbors' houses, but everything was quiet. The snow was falling heavier now, and there was no trace of anyone. Confused and more than a little freaked out, I went back inside, locked the door, and shut the blinds. I tried to put it out of my mind and convince myself that it was just my imagination or some weird coincidence. But even as I sat back down on the couch, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the sound of faint singing, drifting through the walls. It wasn't loud enough to be clear, but it was there like a whisper on the wind. Every time I thought I'd drift off, I would hear it again, just faintly, like the carolers were still out there waiting. The next day I went to work as usual. I didn't tell anyone about what had happened the night before, because I was too embarrassed. But when I came home that evening, I found something on my doorstep. A small, folded piece of paper. It was old-fashioned looking, the kind of thing you'd expect to see in a vintage store. It had no writing on it, just a simple image, 3 figures in long coats, standing in the snow, their faces obscured by shadows. I don't know how it got there. I didn't tell anyone about it, and I didn't take any pictures because I wanted to forget the whole thing. But I haven't been able to. Every year around Christmas, I hear that same song in my head. Every time I see a group of carolers, I feel a shiver run down my spine. So if you ever hear singing in the snow at night, don't open the door. Don't try to make sense of it. Just stay inside and lock the door. Because you might not like what you find when you do. I've always loved Christmas. Always thought it was the one time of year that really brought people together. Every year, without fail, my wife and I would decorate our house with twinkling lights, hang wreaths on the door, and prepare for the neighbors to come caroling. We always welcomed them with hot cocoa, a warm smile, and the joy of the season. But what happened one year completely changed how I saw the holidays. This particular Christmas Eve started out like any other. Snow was falling gently outside, and the world was quiet, blanketed in white. My wife and I had just finished dinner, and we were sitting by the fireplace, enjoying the peace that only a cold winter night could bring. It was the perfect evening, and we were both looking forward to the carolers that usually came by around this time. Then, just as we were about to start watching our favorite holiday movie, I heard a knock on the door. It was a little earlier than usual for the carolers, but I figured they must have been trying to beat the snowstorm that was picking up outside. I got up from the couch and opened the door, expecting to find a cheerful group of singers ready to spread holiday cheer. Instead, what I saw left me frozen in place. Standing on the doorstep were 3 figures, their faces hidden by the heavy snow falling around them. They were dressed in dark, oversized coats with hoods pulled so far forward I couldn't make out their features. It wasn't until they began to sing that I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The song they sang was unlike any Christmas carol I had ever heard. It wasn't the joyful tune of Jingle Bells or Silent Night, no. This song was strange. It had a low, eerie quality, almost like it was coming from somewhere deep underground. The voices were rich and haunting, but they didn't sound human. They were distorted somehow, as if something dark was feeding into the music, making it impossible to ignore. I was about to ask them to stop when my wife, who had come up behind me, whispered for me to let them finish. "It's just a part of the holiday tradition," she said. "Maybe it's a new caroling group?" They sound different, I wasn't so sure, but my wife's insistence made me hesitate. The song felt wrong. As they continued to sing, I noticed something unsettling. The snow around them seemed to be swirling, almost like it was being pulled toward them. The flakes danced erratically, creating a small vortex around the 3 carolers. The stillness of the night was shattered by the unnatural movement in the air. I tried to look at their faces again, but their hoods were too low to see anything. I asked them, "Who are you?" But they didn't respond. They just kept singing, their voices growing louder, as if they were drawing me in. I felt my legs begin to shake. Something wasn't right, but my wife, still standing beside me, didn't seem to notice the oddness of the situation. She was smiling, her eyes closed as if she was savoring the haunting melody. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the song ended. The carolers stopped singing, and for a moment everything was still. The snow stopped falling, the wind stopped howling, and the night was eerily quiet. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath. That's when the first figure, the one closest to me, raised their head slightly, just enough so that I could catch a glimpse of their eyes. But what I saw made my stomach twist into knots. Their eyes weren't human. They were dark, black as coal, and empty, like there was nothing inside. It was like staring into an abyss. The second caroler raised their head, and I saw the same empty, void-like eyes staring back at me. Then the third figure did the same, and I realized with growing horror that I was standing face to face with three people whose eyes weren't right. It was like they weren't even alive. I stepped back, but my wife didn't seem to notice. She was still smiling, lost in the strange trance of their music. I couldn't understand it. This wasn't like any carolers I had ever encountered. There was something deeply wrong about them. That's when the third figure spoke. Not with words, but with a low, rumbling sound that reverberated deep in my chest, like something ancient and terrible was trying to communicate through their voice. "It's time for you to join us," it said. The voice was thick with an accent I didn't recognize, but there was no warmth in it, just cold, empty darkness. I grabbed my wife by the arm, pulling her away from the door, trying to get her inside. But she didn't resist. She didn't seem to notice anything was wrong. It was like she was under some kind of spell. I slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling hands. I turned to look at my wife, but her face was pale, her eyes glassy, as if she were in a trance. I shook her, calling her name, but she didn't respond. She just kept smiling, that same strange, eerie smile. I don't know how long I sat there holding her in my arms, but when I finally looked outside, the carolers were gone. The snow was still swirling outside, but there was no sign of them. No footprints in the snow, nothing. It was like they had never been there. The next few days were a blur. My wife never snapped out of her trance, and no matter what I did, I couldn't reach her. It was as though she had been taken by something, and now she was just gone. Her smile never wavered and her eyes never focused. She was there physically, but mentally she was somewhere far, far away. I still don't know what happened that night. Some say it was just an odd encounter, a group of people out in the snow playing a prank. But I know what I saw and what I heard, and I'll never forget the eyes of those carolers. Every Christmas since then, I've stayed away from the holiday festivities. I don't celebrate, don't even decorate anymore. I can't shake the feeling that those carolers are still out there, waiting to come back for me, or for someone else. So if you hear carolers at your door this holiday season, be careful. You never know what might be hiding behind their smiles. I still remember the first time I experienced it. You'd think that after all these years I would have gotten over it. But the memory is as sharp as ever, and I can't help but revisit it each holiday season. Every time December rolls around, that cold chill creeps up my spine and I think of the carolers. It was 2 years ago, and I had just moved into a new house in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. It was perfect for a fresh start. A cozy home with a fireplace, a nice yard, and a small, welcoming community. Everyone around seemed friendly. I quickly got to know my neighbors, all of whom shared a love for the holidays. They were all eager to start decorating and preparing for the Christmas season. The first week of December, I was invited to a small holiday party at a neighbor's house. I was new to the area, and it seemed like a great opportunity to get to know the people who lived around me. The house was decorated beautifully, with a large tree in the living room and lights twinkling along the roof line. It felt like a real Norman Rockwell painting, the kind of place where you'd expect to hear carolers singing on the front porch. That night, while the party was winding down, the doorbell rang. It was almost midnight, and the snowfall had picked up, thick and heavy. The host, Jane, went to the door, and I followed her, curious to see who could possibly be out in that storm. When she opened the door, a group of carolers stood on the doorstep, their faces hidden beneath long, tattered cloaks. They were all bundled up against the cold, but something about them seemed off. Their presence felt like an intrusion. You know how sometimes you just get a feeling about something? It was like that. A sense of wrongness. But they started to sing, and that's when everything went downhill. The song they sang wasn't like any Christmas carol I'd ever heard. It was an odd mix of jumbled words and a haunting melody that sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't the warmth of Christmas cheer. It was cold, empty, like the song came from some dark, distant place. And as they sang, the air grew colder, colder, colder than it had been even before they arrived. Jane seemed enchanted by their performance, a small smile creeping onto her face as if entranced by the melody. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The more they sang, the more the world outside seemed to disappear, like the snowstorm was fading, and everything around us was quiet. The carolers' voices were louder than the storm outside, like they were filling the entire space around us with their haunting tune. Then, just as abruptly as they began, the carolers stopped singing. Jane stepped forward, reaching for her wallet to give them a tip, but as she did, the carolers turned and began walking away, vanishing into the night. I thought it was over. I thought I could shake off the weirdness of it all, but I was wrong. The next day I woke up to an odd silence in the house. I figured it was just the after effects of the party, but when I went into the kitchen I found Jane. She was standing in front of the window. She didn't say anything when I asked if she was okay. Just stood there, her eyes wide and unblinking. It wasn't until I turned her to face me that I noticed the change in her eyes dark, like they had lost their luster. The vibrant woman who had hosted the party was no longer there. She had become hollow. I was shaken, but I didn't know what to do. She wouldn't speak, not a word. It wasn't until I left her standing there and went to check the front door that things started to make sense. On the doormat, I saw a small, folded piece of paper. I bent down and picked it up, my heart pounding in my chest. It was a note, written in strange, jagged handwriting. "We'll be back for you when the song calls again." I felt like I was suffocating. My fingers trembled as I read those words over and over again. Who had written this? What did it mean? I turned back to Jane, who was still staring out the window, unblinking. I tried to reach for her, but before I could even touch her, the doorbell rang again. I froze, my heart stopping for a second. Who could possibly be out there now? And why did I feel the need to hide from whoever it was? I slowly walked toward the door, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, none of them good. When I looked out through the peephole, I saw them, those same cloaked figures, standing motionless in the snow. They were back. I didn't open the door. I couldn't. But they didn't leave either. They just stood there, singing softly through the door. Their voices, that same haunting song, filling the house, the yard, and the entire world around me. It felt like the song was invading my mind, seeping into my thoughts. It was getting louder. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. I could hear it even when my hands were pressed to my skull. The more I tried to block it out, the worse it got. Then came the knocking. Slow, methodical, almost like they were waiting for me to open the door. I couldn't take it anymore. I rushed to the door, flung it open, but there was no one there. Just snow and silence. I ran back inside, but when I turned around, Jane was gone. I searched the house frantically, looking in every room, calling her name. But there was nothing, no trace of her. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. That night I left the house. I couldn't stay there anymore. I knew that something dark had taken hold of Jane, and I didn't want to stick around to see if it would claim me next. Now, every year when Christmas rolls around, I lock all my doors and close all the blinds. I still hear the carolers' song sometimes, echoing in my mind, and I never forget the note they left behind. 'Cause I know now when the song calls, there's no escaping it. I'd always been a fan of the holidays. Christmas was my favorite time of the year. The decorations, the warmth of the fire, the smells of gingerbread cookies and mulled wine, everything about it filled me with joy. but that joy turned to dread one cold December evening, and I can't shake the feeling that my life was changed forever that night. It started innocently enough. My wife Clara and I had just moved into a new house on the outskirts of town. We'd been dreaming of a quiet life, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. The house was a beautiful Victorian, the kind of place that looked like it was plucked straight from a holiday card. We were excited to make it our own and throw our first Christmas together. A few days before Christmas, while I was out running errands, Clara came home with an armful of Christmas decorations. She was in a fantastic mood, singing along to Christmas carols on the radio. I could hear her humming as I walked up the steps to the door. I couldn't help but smile. That night, after a cozy dinner, we decided to take a walk around the neighborhood to enjoy the lights and decorations. The snow was falling gently, and the world felt like a scene from a Christmas movie. We walked hand in hand, admiring the homes around us. We stopped at a few houses to chat with our new neighbors, all of whom were excited to meet us. It was a peaceful evening, one I will never forget for the wrong reasons. As we were heading back to our house, I heard the faint sound of carolers in the distance. It wasn't uncommon this time of year, so I didn't think much of it. But as we neared our house, the singing grew louder, more distinct. I thought it was nice maybe our neighbors were starting early with their holiday cheer, but something felt off. The song they were singing was different. It wasn't a typical Christmas carol. The melody was slow, almost mournful, and the words didn't quite match. I couldn't make out exactly what they were singing, but I'll never forget the deep, eerie hum that vibrated in my chest as the voices grew nearer. We arrived at our house, and that's when I saw them. There were 3 figures standing at the end of our driveway, just standing there. At first I thought they were just regular carolers, maybe a little odd, but nothing to worry about. But when they turned toward us, I froze. Their faces were hidden by shadows, their movements unnaturally stiff. They weren't dressed in the usual caroler costumes. Their clothes were tattered, dark, and out of place for the holiday season. Clara squeezed my hand, and I could feel the tension building between us. I didn't know why, but something in my gut told me not to let them get any closer. But Clara, she was different. She stepped forward, a small smile on her face, as if she was about to greet them. Her eyes were distant, unfocused. I tried to pull her back, but it was like she wasn't even aware I was there. She was drawn to them like some kind of magnet. I called out to her, but she didn't respond. She kept walking toward the figures. That's when I noticed the oddest thing: the carolers hadn't moved an inch. They just stood there, still, staring at us, their heads tilted at an unnatural angle. It was like they were waiting for something, and I realized with a horrible clarity that something was terribly wrong. I grabbed Clara's arm and yanked her back. She stumbled, shaking her head, as if coming out of a trance. She looked at me with confusion, asking, "Who were they?" I didn't know what to say. I didn't want to admit that I had no idea who those people were or why they had such a strange, otherworldly presence. I pulled her into the house and locked the door behind us. We stood in silence for a moment, catching our breath. But just as I thought it was over, I heard it, faint at first, but growing louder. That eerie, haunting melody. The same song the carolers had been singing. It was coming from somewhere outside, echoing through the walls. I rushed to the window and looked outside. The figures were gone, but the singing didn't stop. It filled the air, growing louder until it felt like the whole world was vibrating with it. It was like the song was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I couldn't escape it. I turned to Clara, but she was staring blankly at the door, her face pale, her lips trembling. She kept saying the same thing over and over: "It's them. They're still out there." I didn't know what to do. The whole night felt like a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. I didn't sleep that night, not a wink. The song kept playing, relentless, like it was embedded in my mind. The next day I decided to call the local authorities. I told them what had happened, but of course they didn't believe me. They said it was probably just a group of pranksters or some weird holiday tradition. But I knew it was more than that. I could feel it in my bones. The carolers never came back, but their song never stopped. It still echoes in my mind, even now, 2 years later. Every Christmas I can hear it in the distance, that same haunting melody that seems to follow me no matter where I go. And Clara, well, she's never been the same. She's withdrawn, quieter now, like she's waiting for something. She says she feels them watching us, and sometimes when I catch her staring out the window, I see a flicker of something in her eyes, a kind of emptiness that wasn't there before. It's hard to explain what happened that night. All I know is that those carolers were no ordinary visitors. They weren't there to spread cheer. They came for something else, something dark, and I don't think they'll ever leave us. There was something.